A few months before the COVID lockdowns began in 2020, Rem Koolhaas's much-awaited exhibition Countryside opened in the Guggenheim in New York. Bummed that I could not see the exhibition, I ordered a copy of Countryside Report, a small but thick pocket-sized handbook with essays from collaborators of the project. It was in this book that I first came across Lenora Ditzler's essay on pixel farming. This very innovative method of farming that questions the widespread monoculture and shows us a new way of looking at agriculture by dividing a farm into smaller pixels. What's more, it proposes to do so with eco-feminist robots. I am Vaissnavi Shukla and this is Architecture Off Center, a podcast where we highlight contemporary discourses that shape the built environment but do not necessarily occupy the center stage in our daily lives. We speak to radical designers, thinkers, and changemakers who are deeply engaged in redefining the way we live and interact with the world around us. So usually when I would start an interview, I would start with a very elaborate prelude on, let me start off with this question. And I've read so much about your work. And of course, we have I don't want to call it a Bible, but this wonderful book where I read your essay for the first time, and then we were on this Zoom call together about 2 years back. You probably don't remember me from then, but we spoke about your work then, and now we are here. So I have a lot of questions, but my first question is very simple. Why farming? What led you to study more about farming? Of everything you could do in the world, not that I promote studying architecture, but why farming sciences, agriculture sciences?
Yes, well, it's a good question, and I don't think my answer will be super direct, but I can give you the kind of winding road that took me here, which I think starts in high school. Well, let's be honest, I think probably earlier, it starts earlier because I grew up in a household where food was really important, and our meals together, getting together to sit around the table and have nice meals was really central to how we connected as a family and also how we connected to friends and community. So that's an important food piece that was always there. And then in high school, I had the opportunity to take a course. I grew up in San Francisco in California and went to a kind of, let's say, non-traditional high school where as a senior, you had this chance to take a course where we all got in a little yellow school bus van and drove around the state of California for 6 weeks studying a topic in the field. And every year the topic changed. And it just happened that the year I was a senior taking this course, the topic was food and agriculture. So we drove around with a whole bunch of bicycles and tents stuffed in the van and visited farmers all over the state for 6 weeks and just spent a lot of time standing around in fields, talking to farmers, trying to understand what challenges they were dealing with, what food production looked like and meant in California. Of course, the whole Central Valley of California is the biggest producer of fresh fruits and vegetables for the whole US. So it's a really important agricultural hub. And there was no real research question or agenda. It was mostly just to try to understand what was happening and what challenges people were dealing with. So it's a very open, loose introduction to what farming looked like. And we went to everything from massive industrial fields selling to nationwide distribution centers, to really tiny 1 hectare family farms where they were growing 30 different things. So the whole range of what was out there. And I think that's where the seed was planted, to use a dumb farming metaphor. But yeah, then it took a long time to come back to actually studying agriculture seriously. I had a roundabout way of getting to academia. I studied actually visual art and environmental sciences in college as a bachelor, and then went on to do a bunch of sort of arts related things and tried to make a living doing seasonal work and going to arts residencies post college, and eventually landed a job as a science teacher at an art school for high school students in California. And when I got there, there was no curriculum for the science class. They just said, do whatever you want. So I said, okay, let's make a big garden and let's make our science curriculum all about farming and food. And there was really nice resources available in California to do that kind of thing. There's a lot of sort of the edible schoolyard movement was really big at that time. But all of those curricula focused on smaller kids, like elementary school students, fourth, fifth graders kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I wanted to try to make a curriculum that had similar principles, but for high school students. So like honors level environmental sciences, basically. So I started doing it and like made all these programs and curriculums and started a huge garden. We got bees and chickens and all kinds of stuff. And it was fantastic, but I sort of reached a level of not being able to push my curriculum farther without studying more myself. And then that's when I went back to get a master's degree.
Look where that got us.
And then, yeah, then I got stuck in academia, which brought me back to the arts, as you showed with that little book. So that's my long story.
No, but it's very interesting. I mean, I didn't know, of course, how you got here, but it of course isn't the case where you grew up on a ranch or your parents were farmers. None of that.
No,
it was because a particular high school, as a part of their pedagogy, thought it was important for people to know where their food comes from, and so then it was kind of this self-initiated project, which
yes.
I mean, I know you have a background in arts, and we'll get to pixel farming because I have a lot of questions, but it's very evident now, knowing that background, how the work that you're currently doing has that bit of a creative process or a creative inclination towards even thinking about farming from a very different perspective. So let's jump into that.
Great.
The reason we're talking right now is because I came across your work in Rem Koolhaas's exhibition called The Countryside, which was supposed to launch maybe a few weeks after the COVID lockdown actually happened, right? So it had launched a few weeks before the COVID lockdown.
Before, it was almost exactly 3 weeks before New York locked itself down.
Yeah. So this was in the Guggenheim, and it was this really large multi-year project where a couple of studios that Rem had even conducted in the Graduate School of Design where I went to grad school. So there were, it had been something that was in process since multiple years, and it was not just multifaceted, but also like geographically very diverse, because there were urban planners and designers from Africa talking about something, and then there were people from the Netherlands talking about something. And then there was, of course, a collective of farmers from the Rust Belt, from like bang in the middle of America, talking about cooperatives. So it really spanned like geographically across the world, quite literally. And when I read your essay, which I thought was very fantastically written because it didn't have that academic tone, it had almost an like arts essay kind of a tone towards talking about something that's very scientific. And this is our cue to jump into pixel farming. So tell me more about pixel farming or pixel cropping. I mean, of course, I've read about it. It's a new way of looking at farming. Okay, this is my version, where you divide the farmland into smaller pixel. Here comes the arts training. And you've devised a way where you can grow a bunch of different crops together in a way that you don't use as many fertilizers, that you keep the soil health intact, but you're also able to produce more. And there's a little bit of math going into it, a little bit of automation and technology going into it. And when you look at the diagram of the pixel farm, there's a lot of art going into it as well.
Yes.
So just handhold us and lead us to how that happened.
Well, that was a fantastic summary. So I think you've grasped the idea well. Yeah, so the main inspiration for pixel cropping was a train of thought, a kind of reasoning logic that the biggest problems coming from agriculture can all be related back to the monoculture way of doing intensive crop farming. That's the norm in industrialized parts of the world. So in where I am now in Western Europe or in the US especially. And so all the big ecological and many of the social issues that we have with agriculture, but that our project really focuses on the ecological issues, come from this style of doing things on a huge scale and just planting giant fields of the same thing. So often genetically identical versions of the same crop. And the logic is that if we are going to remedy the problems that come from that monolinear system, then you have to break up farm fields into smaller units and grow many more diverse kinds of things. So that's just sort of the very simple one-to-one flip. The opposite of monoculture is a polyculture. And the question is how to do that kind of complicated, diverse polyculture farming in an industrialized setting where intensive input use and giant machines and large scales are the norm. So the research project that Pixel Farming came out of took that premise and then came up with a range of ways that we could basically split the industrial crop field into smaller units and then diversify. So it's very geometric, kind of orthogonal approach to
Cartesian, as we call it.
Exactly. Which is appropriate for being in the Netherlands. Yeah. Yeah, so one of the sort of intermediary method that we were testing was strip cropping, which is self-explanatory. You cut the field into long, narrow strips and then plant different things, and you treat each strip as a small field. And then pixel cropping takes that one step further and cuts the field in the other direction. So you end up with a patchwork of small squares, which can each be treated as their own field. And the hypothesis was that if you do this, the smaller and smaller your field unit gets, then the more ecological benefits you should have and the more yield you should have. There's a bunch of agronomic studies that show that more intimate mixing of crops, so things like planting corn and soy or wheat and fava beans, the closer those different species mingle, the more the benefit. So we took that logic and said, okay, then we want the smallest pixels we can manage, and then we should get the most benefit. So it was this very kind of, constructed mathematical Cartesian approach to just, let's see how you can remedy the monoculture, but in an industrialized setting.
Now, there's a bunch of things in this method that I thought were kind of fabulous, because come to think of it in its very basis, like the crux of it is, this is a practice that has been in action. Farmers have been doing it since decades, right? So it's not like you're going to go out and say the world is flat. You know, it's everybody accepts the fact that traditionally farmers used to have a heterogeneous farmland where they would either switch crops based on season, or they would always have 2 or 3 crops going together. And in your work, you of course talk about the three sister or milpa, and somebody else in this season as well. She's from Mexico, and she's written a thesis on, it's called Chasing Milpa, where she talks about how it's quite an indigenous practice in Mexico to plant corn, bean, and squash together, right? So it's something that people have been doing all along. But I think what was really interesting was that you're talking about scaling this practice in a way where you don't really have to trade off a heterogeneous farmland for a monoculture. It's almost like every time we switch scales, we are losing parts of these traditional farming practices at every notch. So one would, of course, be in terms of the things that we grow. So we would lose out a couple of crops that we would have otherwise planted together in favor of one, palm oil. For example, you would lose out on your organic fertilizers or natural, your ecosystems to fertilize the field, or have certain kind of pests or insects, weed out the crops because you're using chemical fertilizers. And then, of course, everything is automated, so you're not able to micromanage it. And I mean, at the seed level, right? Vandana Shiva talks about this a lot. And she talks about how we've traded all of this for like GMOs or genetically modified organisms, where we've reduced the kind of crop that we grow because we just like seeds are patented. But in terms of pixel farming, and of course, I mean, you're coming from an academic perspective and you've done a lot of experiments on this, and you had some very nice insights into how it actually works on ground. Tell us about all the processes that are involved when one starts farming, and how those would differ from, say, like monoculture, where like you just grow wheat, versus pixel farming. How would those processes differ between the two?
Yeah. I think the main difference is just the level of efficiency that you can achieve in a large scale monoculture compared to a pixel crop. But then the caveat is how you define efficient or productive. So we've come to understand efficiency and productivity as it relates to monocultures as being a system where it requires a little amount of human labor, and that you get out of it a lot of product. And that's really only harvestable product. So in the case of a wheat field, we only calculate the amount of grain that comes from that field. And that's our understanding of what productivity and efficiency means in that kind of farming. But in a polyculture like Three Sisters milpa situation, or this kind of industrial Frankenstein version of pixel farming in the Netherlands, those measures of efficiency and productivity aren't that relevant anymore, because there's so many more things that are coming in and out of the system. It's not a simple linear system anymore. So everything gets more complicated, from sowing the field. Instead of just driving a giant tractor around all day to plant your wheat field, you have to manage individual patches of land differently, and probably plant things at different times of the season or of the year. And each thing requires a different approach to how you care for the crop. So then throughout the season, each crop also requires a different amount of time, different tools, different skills and knowledge of how to care for it. And everything just sort of gets exponentially more complex, and also tends to be more time consuming, partially because of this machine issue. So when you have a wheat field, our tractors are made to be able to manage like many hectares in a day, no problem, for one farmer sitting on a tractor. But when you have something that's much more intricately complex in the field, like pixels or other polycultures, then you probably need hand labor, because we don't have machines that can manage those kinds of systems yet. And that just takes a lot more time and a lot more people. So depending on how you look at it, you could say it's a burden that there's so many other complexities and different kinds of knowledges required, or you can look at it as a benefit, that it actually invites this kind of more community approach to doing farming, or more diverse knowledge and skills. And then the theory is that you get a lot more out of it. So in a monoculture, at the end of the season, you make one pass with your tractor and you harvest the one thing that you grew. And in a pixel plot or a forest garden or whatever, then you get to harvest many different things. And ideally, there's also these other ecosystem properties that you're not harvesting. So biodiversity is maybe flourishing on your farm, soil life is building and growing. People might enjoy seeing your farm when they cycle past it. All these other kind of ecological and cultural services that you don't get from a monolinear monoculture.
I think two things that I was thinking about when I was, thinking to myself, what is the difference? I mean, you mentioned most of the cons right now, but in terms of the pros, the factor of time, not just in terms of the time for plantation and harvesting, but the time that the plants themselves would take to create like a mini ecosystem in that little pixel is almost representative of what it would have been otherwise as well, without any human intervention, so to say. Because I think, again, it's in your work, you said during your PhD research, you held all these, different forums through which you would talk to people from different farming traditions. And I think you asked them what they meant by ecosystem or agro ecosystem. And somebody said it's nothing fancy. It's just things that would have otherwise be found in nature coexisting together anyway. And one of the images that you put in the countryside essay is the pixel farm right next to the strip farm. Kind of shows that, right? You have the strip farm, which seems more Cartesian than than your pixel farm. But when you look at the pixel farm, it seems like there has been no human intervention at all. It just seems like it's meant to be organic. But I do get your point about the care they would require, because it's like living in a diverse, socially diverse, racially diverse society where everybody has different needs and wants. And there enters the robots that you also got to work with and prototype. Now, I think when you were prototyping the robots, you worked with farmers and you were trying to figure out at what stage would these robots be required, if at all? Would they be required? I mean, some said they would be required at the stage of sowing because that's very intensive. One person said that he would really want them for weeding, but decided that he would rather weed his farm himself. But where did the idea of robots come in? Did it come purely from the angle of making this viable at an industrial scale, or was there more to having this automation approach?
Yeah. First, I want to come back to something you said just 2 thoughts ago about the difference between the nice orderly strips and the wild looking pixel, because this is one of my favorite things about pixel farming, is this tension between the very orderly grid of what it looks like on a map and this kind of Cartesian
versus
logic.
what it grows,
Yeah, like we're just going to cut the field smaller and smaller, and then we'll have smaller and smaller management units. And then if it gets small enough, maybe it'll look like nature again. So that's one of the things I like about it, is this sort of bizarre way of approaching creating a farming system that's supposed to look and act like nature, but also with this, I feel, very Dutch, orderly, straight-lined methodology of
it's inherently contradictory, don't you think? Because if you didn't know these were plants growing on the pixels, if you just look at the map of the pixels, it's extremely like mechanized. It looks very technological. It looks very artsy, even. But then when you see the plants growing on that pixels, there's almost no semblance of the fact that they were planted in a like orderly geometric pattern. You can't tell this was a pixel crop.
No, especially like we have those little blue field stakes with white flags
Mm-hmm.
that mark the pixels, and that's really the only way you can tell
Mm.
where the plots are. But so I think actually that's a good segue into the where did robots come from topic, because on the one hand, pixel farming is this seems to be this very controllable, mechanizable approach to just making your management units smaller. So in that sense, it would make sense that you would just need smaller and smaller machines,
True.
right? So if your big field needs a giant tractor, then your pixel field needs a tiny tractor or
Yeah.
something. Um, and then the way machine development is going in agriculture is things get bigger and bigger. And that's been the trend, especially with fossil fuel driven
Mm.
machines, which is what
Mm.
most of agriculture is done with, bigger and heavier machines. So the one trend that's going opposite of that is the automation trend. And there's a big push in agriculture right now coming from kind of a economics and labor standpoint that robots are going to be the future of farming, and that we should replace all these giant heavy tractors, which are bad for the soil and need a lot of humans to manage them. We should replace them with these small autonomous machines that are going to be lightweight and not damage the soil so much, and they
Mm.
can work on their own all night long with no humans having to do anything. So there's this move in agriculture in some sense towards smaller machines, and it just makes sense that if you make your field smaller, then a smaller machine could be viable, and then the ones that are being developed are these automated robotic kind of machines. Um, but the other issue is, like you said, it looks super wild and crazy actually growing in the field because everything is so close together. You end up with a whole new
Mm.
set of requirements for what a machine would have to do to be able to manage a sort of natural field like that.
Mm.
Um, and again, then robots come in as a kind of logical response because things like machine learning and sensing technologies are advancing really quickly. And there's potential there for those technologies to be able to manage or to be able to handle the complexity of something like a pixel field.
Mm.
Whereas a very mechanical kind of tractor implement that sort of locks into place and then does the same thing continuously wouldn't make sense in a pixel farm. So with these developments happening and recognizing that we probably needed some sort of smaller tools to do pixel farming, we started questioning whether robotics could be a good option to make pixel farming viable. And it definitely came from the perspective of thinking of pixel farming as a replacement for large scale industrial monocultures.
Mm.
So, like, if you were going to get rid of that 50-hectare field of potatoes and replace it with 1 meter pixels, could a robot do that job?
Mm.
Because there's just no way in a place like the Netherlands where everything is mechanized with big
Yeah.
machines. There's one person driving that tractor. It's not like there's already a community of 50 people working the farm field. The only way to make pixel farming work on that scale would be to have some tools,
Mm.
or a whole new labor structure.
Mm.
But a lot of our work happened like right at the start and the peak of COVID. And there was a lot of, like in other places in the world, shortage of farm labor because many farm laborers
Our
come
migrant
across
communities.
borders.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So we lost a large portion of the migrant farm workers that would normally come to the Netherlands and help with jobs like weeding or harvesting crops that you can't manage with machines. So there started to be a lot more discussion about automation, and supposedly a bunch of new investment and funding went into farm robots. And there were a lot of news
Mm.
stories about how robots are going to take over and solve the labor problems of crises like COVID or migration issues or political problems. And yeah, so the discussion of robots was also just happening around us a lot, and it would come up frequently as the supposed solution to how to do pixel farming at scale. So we started asking if it would be possible, and looking at whether farmers would actually like to use robots, and whether there were any robots being developed that were anywhere close to being ready to use on a farm, and what exactly would a pixel farming robot have to do to be able to work.
Yeah, that was exactly what I was going for, because it's not like this industry is devoid of any kind of automation or mechanization. I mean, I think if you think about technological changes and development, probably agriculture is like the single most industry where it's seen so much of development in terms of tractors and instruments and equipments and everything, right from like sowing to harvesting to storage even. I mean, I'm trying to get somebody on this season who's written a lot about how development in the construction industry really helped the agricultural industry, because construction materials that were being developed like alternately in the world were being used to make grain silos to store grain. So anything that was happening in the world outside had an application in the agricultural industry. I think the only, from a very simplistic viewpoint, the only addition the robot would bring, and which is like a large addition, is the factor of intelligence, right? Because a lot of these things are already mechanized, but they need human supervision. The robot would probably bring artificial intelligence, which would help itself do certain things. But my question is, the robot might be able to do weeding, sowing, harvesting. In terms of the infrastructure of care, because you do speak a lot about the relationship that a farmer has with his farmland, or the community has as a collaborative with what they're growing, even plants with each other, with the insects, with the bugs, and even the South Asian student who told you that the ducks come and weed out their farms,
Yeah.
So what aspect of care would you hypothetically relegate to a robot, and what you would certainly keep away from it? Because it seems like when you get into robotics and automation or artificial intelligence, it's like opening a can of worms. Once it's out, it's out. There's no stopping it.
Yeah, this is a huge question, especially because I think in the robotics narratives, and particularly farming robotics, the element of care doesn't seem to be present. There are these kind of well-known headlines from the Guardian newspaper. They write a lot about farming robotics for some reason. And there was one a couple years ago that was announcing the rise of the robot farmer will have space bots with lasers zapping plants. And then there was another one about a weeding robot that was going to murder weeds with an electric bolt.
That sounds a little dystopian.
Totally. And the language of these articles and these headlines is very much about a dominant, sort of violent approach to doing farming, which is all about eliminating everything that's not your crop. And that, whether that's a pest or a weed or whatever. So that's the kind of narrative that's happening in robotics, in a lot of robotics. And switching that to an element of care is quite radical. But I think it's necessary to think about robotics in that way if we're going to apply them to these agroecological complicated systems like pixel farming. Because in a system like that, you want things to interact and intermingle, and you want nature to find a balance. So that means not just eliminating every pest, but rather creating an environment where the pests are not getting out of control, because there's also a natural enemy of that pest present, and that there's a natural balance that arrives. So there are some pests, but it doesn't cause a huge problem because there's also the enemies of that pest and they control each other. Similarly for weeds or diseases or anything else that we see in agriculture normally as a big problem that has to be gotten rid of. So in order to manage a system in that way, where you're not just looking at it as a binary either or, like good, bad, weed, crop, pest, enemy, you need a more nuanced approach to seeing difference and balance and symbiosis and connectivity between elements. And I think the way to do that then is to think of it as a system that you're nurturing or caring for, rather than one that you're trying to strictly control and eliminate. But how to build that into a tool of any kind, especially an automated robotic tool, is still a huge open question that I don't have a good answer to. And maybe it's not possible. Which is also an answer.
No, but then what do you think? Okay, let me rephrase this. I thought this would be simpler, this question, because I don't have anything written today. I'm gonna try to wing it as best as I can. What do you think this hypothetical robot, were it to exist, how do you think it would differ from this robot who zaps and murders weed? Now, what I'm going towards is, in your essay, you call these robots eco-feminist robots, right? Of course, maybe at the end of the day, their functions might be similar. You know, they weed out pests, they blah, 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 they harvest, they sow. But why an eco-feminist robot? There's a whole discourse on this, but never really related it to a robot of all, nouns that come after ecofeminism. And I never thought there would be a robot that would be an ecofeminist robot.
Yeah, well, I still wonder if there is, if there will ever be such a robot. But yeah, the idea for the ecofeminist robot came out of this kind of problem of trying to match the current narratives in agricultural robotics and the needs, both ecological and community wise, of more diverse farming systems, non-monocultures of any kind. And one thing that happened to me a lot at the beginning of my PhD, when I was starting to study pixel cropping, was that I would tell people what it was about and show them the field, and they would say, okay, but how are you going to do the labor? This is not possible. This is unrealistic. Why are you even bothering? And I would say, well, I heard that there's going to be a cool new robot and maybe it could do the work for us. My supervisor had told me that there were robotics being developed very quickly and that maybe that would solve the labor problem. And as soon as I said the word robot in the context of this sort of organic, holistic approach to farming, I got a lot of pushback. People got really upset sometimes. Like, why would you introduce automation and data-driven technologies in an agroecological context? That's totally anti-ecology, it's anti-farmers.
So it's almost like they are mutually exclusive, and for them, they could never really coexist.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's a sort of polarized vision between the monoculture world of robotics and then the agroecological world of farming, and they don't really seem to match up. Because agroecology is all about food sovereignty, which I think you spoke about in the last episode. Community and being situated and local, finding local solutions and connections between people and plants and foods and traditions and ecologies, social justice and autonomy of farmers. And a lot of what's coming out of this sort of agriculture 4.0 technology, data-driven future that's being pushed on farmers is the exact opposite. Like, all this data is being harvested that's being taken away from farmers and they have no autonomy or ownership. Exactly. Farmers can't even fix their own tractors. They're not allowed to because of laws coming from the autonomous tractor companies, things like that. So there's an obvious disconnect. so then, yeah, when we were having these conversations, I started asking people, well, okay, fine. So currently robotics and agroecology don't seem to be compatible, but is there any scenario under which they could be compatible? Could you imagine a robot that would work for agroecology? And the way people started describing what agroecology meant to them and what a robot would need to do just started triggering this sort of recognition that, oh, this sounds a lot like ecofeminism. And my colleague who I've been doing a lot of this work with, Clayman Streisen, who we wrote the robot paper with and was also part of the Countryside exhibition. He's a cultural geographer and a philosopher and has looked a lot at the relationship between farmers and cows and robotics, so milking machines as a new technology entering farming and how that changes farmers' relationships with their cows and their farming practices. So he entered the dialogue and we started talking. He threw out this idea that this all sounded a lot like ecofeminism, and we started investigating it and reading and talking and testing the idea with different people. And I would say that it's still very much an open can of worms because it raises also probably even more kind of emotional and critical response to say that we want an ecofeminist robot than to say an agroecological robot. But what we're trying to do now is kind of break down more concretely what the so-called demands of an ecofeminist robot for pixel farming or any kind of farming could be, and to try to narrow in on what the core characteristics and values could be. So in some way, a lot of that is still drawn from the sort of original ecofeminist thinkers, the people working a lot in the 90s, the sort of California wave of ecofeminism of the early 90s, which is a lot about getting rid of binaries and dualisms and bringing in an element of care and connecting a sense of well-being and identity to the land, and those types of things. But then also bringing in more contemporary approaches to the way humans relate to nature and each other and machines. So we're looking more at new materialist studies and scholars. A lot of more than human philosophical approaches are looking at these kinds of questions. So we're now trying to expand out of the sort of original ecofeminist box and look at it more as a way of capturing the ethos of farming in a farming machine. And then what would you need to do to make that happen?
It sounds very fascinating. Almost seems like it's utopia being realized at like an arm's length, because you read about stuff, and in a lot of ways it sounds like it's too good to be true, but probably not. Probably it is possible, and maybe in the near future we will see ecofeminist robots on our fields, and for the good, I think, right?
But maybe it is too good to be true. I think we have to leave that open as a possibility, at least currently, that maybe robots are just not the answer. I think maybe you saw we did this project with a group of design students in our journey through farming robotics. We asked a bunch of different groups of people to make a prototype pixel farming robot with this list of sort of ecofeminist demands. And one group of engineers drew up a very traditional looking robot. Fine, that's what they came up with. And then we presented the same challenge to a group of design students, and they didn't know much about farming at all. And they completely rejected the idea of a robot. They just said, no way, why would we make a robot? What's the point? That the farmer, to do this kind of farming, just needs a simple hand tool that's ergonomically designed, that's going to make her job comfortable every day. What do you even need a robot for? The farmer has the knowledge, the care,
Yeah.
The ability to see the difference between two different kinds of weeds, like why bother with this complicated technology? So that, I think that's also a valid approach. Or the farmer in Indonesia who has ducks do the
Who has
job for
ducks?
her.
Yeah.
Yeah. So those are also options.
So where are we with the research? What are you working on? What's next? And how's pixel farming coming along?
Pixel farming is, I think, maybe in its current form coming to its natural end, at least in our field trial. We've been doing the field experiment for 5 years now. And in one more season, it will have completed its full rotation cycle. So I think at that point, we're going to stop collecting data. And I don't know what's going to happen. We'll hopefully have some sort of ceremony where we plow it under and say goodbye.
Hopefully with good coffee.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So that version of the experiment, I think, is coming to an end soon, but there's a lot of discussion about what could be a next version, something more practical, taking what we've learned from these last years and then trying to design something that looks different. There are a few offshoots that have started to sprung up, which make me super excited. There was the farmer here in the Netherlands who tried pixel farming for a couple years. And there's now a farm in Switzerland that's doing an experiment with pixel farming. They just started last summer.
Nice.
And I'm hoping that it'll sort of, grow naturally, that people will pick up the idea and test it and modify it and make it their own in other places. But what I'm personally looking at next is not so much taking pixel cropping in as it has existed, but the sort of general idea of complex futuristic farming systems and relationships between knowledge and complexity and technologies in these future farming systems, and sort of upscaling that at a more conceptual level. I just started a position as a researcher in a network of farms called the Global Network of Lighthouse Farms, which is a research network of farms that are doing something super innovative in regards to sustainability, and connected to their communities in really novel and exciting ways. And there's 12 farms around the world, and they're part of this network where they meet and talk and learn from each other.
Nice.
And then we also send master students there to do studies based on research questions developed in collaboration with the farmers themselves. And there's a huge variety of innovations and ways that they're dealing with sustainability. So I think my first task in that network is to get a grip on what's happening with these themes of complexity and technology and innovation, and how farmers are thinking about the future, and figure out how to do some sort of cross-site analysis, which I haven't landed on what the research question will be, but it'll be taking all the ideas of pixel farming and then upscaling it to a bunch of different complicated, innovative farming systems around the world.
If you were to go back and teach those art students like you did before undertaking this large project, how would you do it differently now?
The high school students in California, you mean? My art school job. Yeah, I think I would do everything different.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've just learned so much about what's possible in farming. What we were doing previously was growing a kind of small garden of vegetables, and we produced eggs and things that we sent to the kitchen, the dining hall, for the students to eat for their meals. And I had made these little assignments for them to do in the garden that were sort of science assignments. But as I said, a lot of it was based on curriculum that I got from 4th and 5th graders. Okay. So I tried to scale up the depth of learning to the appropriate age group. But I think now I would go the other way around and sort of take what I've been doing at academic university level and then bring that to a high school audience. Because I think actually they're capable of so much more complex thinking than what I was capable of at that time, because I hadn't really studied or delved into it as much as I have now. So I have a ton of ideas for how I could rewrite a high school science curriculum. Yeah. And also how to bring art more into the equation. Yeah.
Well, this was a pleasure, Dr. Lenora Ditzler. Thank you so
Vaissnavi.
much. Well, I wish you a day full of good coffee and stay in touch.
Thanks very much. That was really great. Nice talking to you, and thanks for having me.
Special thanks to Ayushi Thakur for the research and design support, and Kahan Shah for the background score. For guest and topic suggestions, you can get in touch with us through Instagram or our website arcofcenter.com, both of which are ARCHOFFCENTRE. And thank you for listening.